We live in a world of predictable seasons and relative safety, where the biggest disasters we see are on screen. Our horizons are clear, and the change from day to night seems like an immutable law of the universe. But tens of thousands of years ago, our ancestors lived in a world that could change overnight, without warning and irrevocably. Their reality was shaped by forces we can barely imagine. Supervolcano eruptions capable of plunging the planet into darkness, and glacial storms that froze continents in ice. It was a time when humanity, which had not yet built a single city, faced a threat on a planetary scale. Their struggle was not for territory or resources, but for the very right to exist. It was an era when the very survival of the Homo sapiens species hung in the balance. Ancient humans faced climatic upheavals that should have wiped them off the face of the earth, but they persevered. Their story is not just one of survival, but a testament to the incredible resilience and ingenuity inherent in our very nature. Watch the video to the end to learn how a simple bone awl became the key to survival in an icy hell, and what strategy allowed small groups of people to survive the global catastrophe caused by the eruption of the Toba volcano. Imagine the landscape of the Pleistocene long before the cataclysm. It was a world of lush vegetation where vast expanses were covered with forests and savannas. The climate was much milder, and natural cycles were stable and predictable. Groups of ancient people led a nomadic lifestyle, moving across vast territories following the changing seasons. Their roots had been refined over millennia, passed down from generation to generation. They were familiar with every valley, river, and mountain pass. Their existence was completely synchronized with nature. They knew the rhythms of the world around them, when certain fruits ripened, where to find sources of clean water, and how to predict the weather by the direction of the wind. This deep connection with their environment was the basis of their successful existence. The tools they used were simple but effective, ideal for stable conditions. Stone axes and scrapers allowed them to cope with all their daily tasks. There was no need for sophisticated technology because nature itself provided everything they needed. The social structure was simple and based on family ties. Groups were small, which allowed them to remain mobile and not deplete resources in one area. Conflicts were rare, as there was enough space for everyone. They perceived the world as eternal and unchanging. Their mythology and worldview probably reflected this cyclicality and predictability. The changing seasons and the movement of the stars all confirmed the idea of an unbreakable order of things. Nothing foreshadowed the coming changes. Beneath their feet, deep within the Earth's crust, a monstrous force was gathering, capable of destroying their world in an instant. This hidden threat was beyond their understanding and perception. Their lives, filled with everyday concerns, passed in ignorance of the fragility of their paradise. They were masters of their world, but not its rulers. However, this stability was an illusion built on geological calm that could not last forever. Soon they would face a test that would require not just the ability to survive, but a complete overhaul of their thinking, technology, and society. Their world was on the brink of disaster. What interested you most about the primitive era? Approximately 74,000 years ago, an event of planetary scale occurred on the island of Sumatra, the eruption of the Toba supervolcano. It was not just a volcano, it was a catastrophe that spewed thousands of cubic kilometers of ash and gases into the atmosphere. The sound of the eruption was probably heard thousands of kilometers away, and the earth shook across the entire continent. The sky darkened around the world for years, blocking out sunlight and plunging the planet into twilight. A thick layer of volcanic ash and sulfur compounds rose into the stratosphere, forming an impenetrable veil. The sun, if it broke through at all, looked like a dull, lifeless disk. The consequences were rapid and global. Temperatures across the planet dropped sharply by an average of 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, ushering in a period known as the volcanic winter. Summer was no longer distinguishable from winter, and snow began to fall even in tropical regions. Vegetation deprived of sunlight for photosynthesis began to wither en masse. Forests turned into dead thickets, and grasses on the plains died, covered with a layer of toxic ash. This destroyed the basis of the entire food chain. Water sources were poisoned. Ash settled in polluted rivers and lakes, making the water undrinkable. Acid rain caused by sulfur emissions destroyed the remaining flora, and made the environment even more hostile. For ancient people, this meant that their familiar world had collapsed. Familiar landmarks disappeared under a layer of ash, and the air became heavy and acrid. Their knowledge of nature became useless overnight. Their usual food sources disappeared. Large herbivores, deprived of pasture, migrated or died out. Edible plants died, and those that remained could be poisonous due to volcanic fallout. Constant cold became the main threat. Human body temperature must be maintained at a constant level, and in a world where the average temperature had fallen to critical levels, hypothermia became a constant danger. Survival was no longer a matter of finding the best hunting grounds. It became a daily struggle against a world that had suddenly become hostile. Every decision, every step required enormous effort and extreme caution. How could one stay warm when the atmosphere itself had become cold and the usual fuels were in short supply? To answer this question, we need to understand how ancient people rethought the very concept of fire, which we will discuss in the next chapter. In the conditions of a volcanic winter, fire ceased to be a mere convenience. It became the center of the universe for each group of people. The campfire became an anchor, holding a small island of life in the middle of an icy and dark world. The main task was not to obtain fire, but to preserve it at all costs. Losing fire would mean quick death from hypothermia in a world of eternal twilight. Therefore, each group probably had one or more people responsible for maintaining the flame. The role of firekeeper became one of the most important and honorable. People developed new techniques for carrying fire during migrations. Smoldering coals or slowly burning tinder fungi were placed in special containers. These containers could be made of clay, stone with a hollowed-out cavity, or even the horns of large animals, which allowed the heat to be preserved for hours. The approach to fuel also changed. When the usual firewood became scarce due to the decline of forests and widespread dampness, people showed remarkable ingenuity. They learned to use everything that could burn, carefully exploring the world around them. Dry peat and compressed moss, which were dug out from under a layer of ash, came into use. These materials burned slowly and provided even heat. Such adaptation required new knowledge about the properties of soil and vegetation. The bones of large animals became a special resource. Saturated with fat, they could burn for a very long time, although they produced less heat and more soot than wood. Bone fires probably became a common sight at campsites of that time. Fire also became indispensable for cooking. Heat treatment made it possible to eat tough roots and tubers that had not been consumed before. Cooking and baking neutralized some toxins and made food more digestible. The fire became the center of social life. The whole group gathered around it to warm up, cook food, and find psychological support. In a world of eternal twilight, the light of the fire dispelled not only darkness, but also fear. It was probably around the fire that the art of storytelling developed. The transmission of myths, stories, and practical knowledge became vital for the cohesion of the group. Fire helped strengthen social bonds and preserve culture. Finally, fire remained the main weapon of defense. In a changed world, predators, also suffering from hunger, could become more aggressive. Bright flames and thick smoke were the only reliable means of keeping them at a safe distance. The sharp cold snap forced people to completely rethink their ideas about shelter. Temporary open-air camps or simple shelters made of branches could no longer protect against the bitter cold. More reliable, permanent, and well-insulated shelters were needed. Caves and rock grottos became the preferred locations for long-term settlements. They provided natural protection from wind, rain, snow, and volcanic ash. Their main advantage was thermal stability. Deep inside the caves, the temperature remained constant throughout the year. People learned to adapt caves for living. They built internal partitions from stones or skins, creating separate living areas. The entrance was often covered with several layers of skins to prevent drafts. Where there were no caves, people began to build semi-dugouts, one of the greatest inventions of that era. They realized that the earth itself is an excellent heat insulator. A dwelling dug into the ground required much less fuel for heating. The construction process was laborious. First, using sharpened sticks and stone tools, a pit up to 1.5 meters deep was dug in the ground. The walls of the pit were reinforced with vertically placed stones or large bones to prevent the soil from crumbling. Then a roof frame was erected over the pit. For this purpose, thick branches or tree trunks were used. which were arranged in the shape of a cone or dome. This structure had to withstand the weight of insulation and snow. The roof frame was covered with several layers of skins, bark, or woven mats. On top of it all, a thick layer of earth, moss, and turf was added. Such a multi-layered roof provided excellent thermal and water insulation. A hearth was located in the center of the dwelling. Smoke escaped through a special opening in the roof, which could be covered in bad weather. The floor was covered with dry grass, moss, or skins for additional warmth. The location of such settlements was carefully chosen. Preference was given to southern slopes of hills, protected from northern winds, and receiving maximum scarce sunlight. Proximity to a source of unfrozen water was also critically important. The creation of such shelters required collective effort and advanced construction skills. This testifies to a high level of social organization and the ability of people to plan for the long term. What other materials do you think could have been used to insulate such primitive structures? In the next chapter, you will learn how people protected not their homes, but their own bodies. Before the onset of global cooling, clothing was probably more symbolic in nature or served to protect from the sun. However, in the conditions of glacial storms and volcanic winters, it became a vital tool for survival. Simple capes made of animal skins no longer provided protection from the piercing cold and dampness. A real technological revolution took place, comparable in significance to the discovery of fire. Humans invented the bone needle with an eye. This seemingly simple tool made it possible to sew pieces of skin together, creating complex, form-fitting clothing that completely covered the body. The process of making clothes was complex and multi-stage. First, the skins had to be processed. They were cleaned of flesh and fat residues with stone scrapers. Then they were kneaded and treated with special compounds to make them soft and elastic. After tanning, the skins were cut into separate pieces using sharp stone blades. This required a precise understanding of how to create a three-dimensional object from flat pieces. It is likely that there were craftsmen who specialized in this particular craft. Threads were made from tendons or thin strips of leather. The thread was threaded through holes pierced with an awl or needle, and the pieces were sewn together with a strong, tight seam. The first prototypes of modern clothing appeared. Pants protected the legs, jackets with hoods protected the torso and head, mittens or gloves protected the hands, and soft shoes, similar to moccasins, protected the feet. Creating a complete set of winter clothing was a laborious process that took weeks. It required not only individual skill, but also the coordinated efforts of several members of the group. This technology gave people an incredible advantage. A properly dressed person could stay out in the cold longer, travel greater distances, and hunt more effectively, which in those conditions was equivalent to survival. The disappearance of many plant and large animal species forced ancient humans to radically change their diet and foraging strategies. The usual methods of hunting and gathering no longer worked. Survival depended on the ability to adapt and use whatever resources were available, however scarce they might be. There was a shift towards more reliable and predictable food sources. Coastal groups living near the seas and oceans found themselves in a more advantageous position. They switched to intensive use of marine resources. Shellfish, crustaceans, and other intertidal creatures became the basis of their diet. These sources of protein were available year-round and did not require sophisticated tools to harvest. Archaeologists find huge piles of shells at sites from this period, indicating the importance of this food source. In addition to shellfish, people learned to catch fish using bone harpoons and possibly primitive nets made of plant fibers. They also gathered edible seaweed, rich in vitamins and minerals, which was critically important given their meager diet. Away from the coast, the strategy was different. People focused on gathering edible roots, bulbs, and tubers that could be found underground, protected from the cold. This required a deep knowledge of botany to distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones. This flexibility in food selection and the development of new technologies for obtaining and processing food became a decisive factor that allowed humanity to survive the darkest times. They learned to take from nature the little that it could still offer. What plants do you think could survive in the conditions of a volcanic winter? In the next chapter, we will look at how social ties changed in the face of a global threat. Catastrophic environmental changes led to a profound transformation of the social structure of ancient communities. The old way of life became impossible, and only those groups that were able to quickly restructure and adapt their social ties to the new, harsh reality survived. Large groups that required enormous amounts of resources for sustenance were likely to be unviable. Feeding several dozen people in a depleted world became an impossible task. Large communities probably fragmented. Small, more mobile, and cohesive groups consisting of several families became the basic social unit. This structure was much more flexible. A small group could move faster, required less food, and was less noticeable. Social evolution went hand in hand with technological evolution. People survived not only because they invented the needle and warm dwellings, but also because they learned to be more cohesive, organized, and caring for one another. Difficult conditions became a powerful catalyst for technological progress. Ancient people were forced to create more sophisticated, efficient, and specialized tools to cope with new challenges. There was a real leap in the technology of working with stone and other materials. Flint remained the main raw material, but the techniques for working it reached a new level of sophistication. The so-called flake technique became widespread. Craftsmen learned to chip long, thin stone flakes with razor-sharp edges from a specially prepared core, nucleus. These plates were universal blanks. They were used to make knives for cutting carcasses, scrapers for processing skins, piercers, and chisels. This technology was very economical. From one piece of flint, it was possible to obtain many more useful tools than when using the old methods. Composite tools appeared. Ancient people learned to attach small stone blades, microliths, to a bone or wooden base. This is how the first harpoons with serrated tips, knives with replaceable blades, and other complex tools appeared. In addition to stone, people began to actively and skillfully use bone, horn, and tusk. These materials were strong, light, and elastic. They were used to make needles, awls, spearheads, fish hooks, and even jewelry. Working with bone required special skills and tools. Deep cuts were made in the bone with stone cutters, and then it was split into pieces. After that, the pieces were ground and polished with abrasive stones to the desired shape. Technologies became more standardized. At different sites, hundreds of kilometers apart, archaeologists find very similar types of tools. This suggests that there were common cultural traditions and technologies that were passed on between groups. Each new tool was a response to a specific challenge. The harpoon allowed people to catch fish, the needle allowed them to sew warm clothes, and the scraper allowed them to process skins efficiently. Technology became the key that opened up access to new resources. The development of technology required the development of thinking. The creation of a complex composite tool is a multi-step process that requires planning, abstract thinking, and precise coordination of movements. This technological leap not only helped humans survive the Ice Age, but also laid the foundation for all subsequent achievements of humanity. It was then that the basic principles of engineering and craftsmanship were mastered. Surprisingly, it was during this most severe and difficult period in human history that a veritable explosion of creative activity took place. Faced with chaos and the threat of extinction, people did not limit themselves to purely utilitarian tasks. On the contrary, they turned to art and symbols to make sense of and organize their world. The first indisputable decorations appeared. People began to make beads from shells, animal teeth, stone, and bone. They drilled holes in them and probably wore them around their necks or sewed them onto their clothes. These items were not just trinkets. They had a deep social meaning. They indicated a person's status and their belonging to a particular clan or tribe. Jewelry could be part of marriage rituals or used as amulets. Pieces of ochre, a natural mineral dye in red, yellow, and brown colors, have been found at the sites. Ochre was ground into powder and mixed with fat or water to be used as paint. It could be used to paint bodies, clothing, tools, or cave walls. The first engravings appear. People carved intricate geometric patterns on pieces of bone, antler, or flat stones. These ornaments testify to a developed sense of rhythm, symmetry, and abstract thinking. Art performed important psychological and social functions. In a world full of danger and uncertainty, creating orderly patterns and beautiful objects provided a sense of control and harmony. It was a way to make the hostile world more understandable and familiar. The collaborative creation of artworks or the performance of rituals involving coloring and decoration brought the community together. This strengthened the sense of unity and shared identity that was critical for survival. Art became a way of storing and transmitting information. Geometric patterns could be primitive maps, calendars, or records of myths. Through symbols, important knowledge about the world was passed down from generation to generation. Perhaps it was then that the first complex religious ideas emerged. People tried to find explanations for the cataclysms that were happening by turning to supernatural forces. Art became a language for communicating with the spirit world. This cultural explosion proves that even in the most inhuman conditions, our ancestors remained human. Their need for beauty, meaning, and symbols was as strong as their need for food and warmth. The Toba eruption and the subsequent Ice Age had a huge formative influence on the entire subsequent history of humanity. Some geneticists adhere to the theory that the number of people on the planet at that time fell to a critical minimum, possibly to a few thousand or tens of thousands of individuals. This phenomenon is known as the bottleneck effect. Imagine a bottle filled with a variety of balls. This is all of humanity before the catastrophe. If you turn the bottle upside down, only a few balls will fall out. These are the few who survived. All subsequent diversity will come from them. All of us living today are descendants of those few who managed to survive in those unimaginable conditions. This means that modern humanity has much less genetic diversity than many other species. We are all very close relatives. Traces of this ancient struggle are embedded in our DNA. The surviving groups passed on to their descendants the genes that helped them adapt. These could have been genes responsible for more efficient metabolism, allowing them to survive when food was scarce. After the end of the Ice Age, the descendants of the survivors, armed with new technologies and knowledge, began to rapidly explore new territories. They settled in Siberia, crossed over to America, and reached Australia. The catastrophe that nearly destroyed humanity ultimately made it stronger and paved the way for global domination. The story of our ancestors' survival is not just a chapter in an archaeology textbook. It is a fundamental part of our own identity, embedded in our genes and culture. It is a reminder of the incredible resilience that allowed humanity not only to survive, but ultimately to build a civilization. Today we are immersed in a world where every day was a test of endurance. The eruption of the Toba volcano and the severe ice storms were not just natural phenomena. They were the greatest test in human history, and our ancestors passed it, albeit at an incredibly high price. They survived not through brute force, but through intelligence, cooperation, and incredible adaptability. Every garment sewn, every flame preserved, every new tool was a step toward victory over chaos. Their legacy is not stone axes and cave paintings, but our very ability to overcome difficulties, which is embedded in us at the genetic level. Which of the ancient people's survival methods did you find most ingenious and why? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into the past.